Well, I would like to go on a little bit about Dodd-Frank re-regulation, but maybe some of you have some questions along those lines. And I think we'd love to throw it open to the audience. We have the facilities to do that.
I think one of the difficulties, and I don't want to go see a computer, but I do want to see a doctor who can benefit from, look, there are such a wide array of new research findings coming out every day, even in the field that I'm in economics, that it is extraordinarily difficult for any human being, including me, in my field, to keep up with them. I like having summaries available and having suggestions to me to supplement my professional expertise. And I would want my doctor to have the same thing. I mean, we face a significant problem in that even best practice protocols take a while to spread throughout any system, naturally. And the question is whether we can do things that help doctors do what they do even better. And it's at least my hope that technology can help on that, not as a replacement, but as a supplement. Now, in terms of the return to healthcare spending, the way I would say it is this. There's no question that innovation in healthcare has dramatically helped. It's not the key driver of improved life expectancy. There are other changes that are more important, but it has helped expand and increase life expectancy, and it has helped to improve lives. There's no question about it. I think the question is whether we can get the same results or similar results at a lower cost, or if there's a better trade-off between quality and expenditure without denying that there have been huge quality improvements. I think that is the challenge, which is, the MRI has been a huge benefit in many settings, but I think there are also big questions about whether MRIs are overused in low benefit applications. And can we somehow, over time, curtail the low benefit applications but still get the high return ones? I think that is the key question, because the alternative is we can't, unfortunately, afford a system where we're always just doing more, even if it's not necessarily better. We just can't afford it. So we have to be moving towards quality and value, which is a difficult transition, but I think is unfortunately unavoidable.
Okay, more questions.
Please wait for the microphone, okay?
Yes.
Two ladies here, please wait for the microphone. Now we're not going to be able to hear you.
There's a gentleman here in the, I saw his hand first.
Peter, in 1982, I think the government was paying 12 or 13 or 14% for long-term money. Today we're paying 3.5%. I guess my questions are, why? Is that sustainable? What's the impact on the deficit? And does anybody in Washington think this is, really going to continue when they're factoring in their plans?
So let me answer the latter part of it first. The way I think about it is the following. We have two very powerful cycles going on, and they're in conflict with one another. One is international creditors looking around the world, not seeing any particularly attractive alternative safe haven, not wanting to experience depreciation on their existing dollar-denominated assets. This cycle can continue for a while, as opposed to we're on an unsustainable fiscal course, it's going to blow up, and so on and so forth. At some point, we will flip from one equilibrium to another. But confident predictions about exactly whether, when that will happen strike me as not high in credibility. Over the next decade, if we don't address this problem, probability is shockingly high in my view. But over a 12-month period or a 24-month period, no one can confidently say we're going to shift from one to another. The risk is that when that shift does ultimately happen, it can happen much faster and messier than you'd expect. And that's the risk that getting ahead of this problem would avoid, but that I fear, given the points we were talking about earlier with polarization and a political system that doesn't deal well with gradual long-term problems, that deals with crises, we might not avoid. The analogy is, a friend of mine made an analogy to an M&M, which is if you go on a diet and you look at an M&M, you say, I don't know the exact number, it's only got 3 calories in it, so you can rationally say, oh, I'll eat one of those M&Ms, it's only 3 calories, who cares? And then of course you can apply that same logic to the next M&M, and the next one, and so on and so forth, and then you've eaten 3 bags. Same thing, if you've got a 2-year electoral cycle, the chance that this thing is going to blow up over the next 2 years is pretty low. And yet you'd pay immediate political cost for dealing with it ahead of time. And so it gets deferred until you're in more of a crisis mode. Another way of putting it is, to follow up on what you said, strikes me as unlikely that we will actually tackle this medium or long-term fiscal problem in a serious way when the 10-year yield is at 3.5%.
Okay. Ma'am, right next to the former questioner.
Yes, earlier you mentioned recommending going back to the 1990 tax code and letting all the cuts expire. Do you mean to include in that the estate tax, which would go back to having a $1 million deduction, which would mean, of course, that estates would be then paying 45% to the U.S. government? And is that inherently fair?
I think that I was talking about the income tax changes, and the numbers I gave applied to income taxes. On the estate tax, look, the political system is probably going to wind up with something in the $4 to $5 million range, with a tax rate of, in the mid-50s or maybe a little bit below that, let's say 50, 45%. Probably not ideal, but better than eliminating it from my perspective. It does not strike me as likely, given some of the misinformation, frankly, that has been distributed about the estate tax, that we're going to go back to the 1990s, the full 1990s version. But in any case, no, what my comments were with regard to the income tax.
Let me, I see this gentleman here on the aisle, right there to your right.
Thank you. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, who worked for you for a time and head of bioethics at NIH, seemed to have had a great plan for universal health care, wherein there were vouchers which may have included, as well as private insurers, Medicare, but paid for with a dedicated VAT, which seemed like it would have some good benefits, like asking imports to carry an equal amount of burden as domestic production, and also forcing consumers to focus on the cost benefit if they were looking for increased benefits in the future. What did you think of that, and why didn't that get some airing?
Well, I think there are a couple comments and a couple differences, by the way, there have been analogies driven between Zeke's approach and Mr. Ryan's approach, and they are quite different. I mean, one obviously is the one that you just mentioned, which is that the revenue source is significantly different. There's a huge question about a value-added tax. If I were just going back to my Brookings days and giving you the kind of think tank or academic perspective, there'd be one set of answers. If I were going to give you the political perspective, there are a completely different set of responses inherent in that. I think the more important point, the reason that I raised the question of just allowing all the tax cuts to expire, I don't see a value-added tax being remotely viable politically over the next few years, and therein lies the problem. So just even maybe to stop on that, I just don't think that it's within the viable range, which is why, coming back to my point about 34 votes in the Senate, it strikes me that rather than a new tax, which is easily disfigured in popular debate because it will have some catastrophic consequences, even though other countries that have adopted it haven't experienced those catastrophic consequences, it's better to return to something that we've already experienced because people here know what that means. Now, I guess the other part of your question, though, was very briefly on choice within healthcare. Look, there are some benefits from moving towards consumer-directed healthcare, and I hope that came across. The point is they're often oversold, and we have to just be careful not to think that that's the panacea. And frankly, interestingly, most advocates for consumer-directed healthcare are adamantly opposed to some things that I would describe as consumer-directed health, including, for example, advanced directives, which are voluntary and are therefore consumer-directed. That may do more to constrain those high-cost cases or to reduce them than any other component of, quote, consumer-directed healthcare, but the advocates of consumer-directed healthcare don't count them as consumer-directed.
Let me try, anybody on this side of the room? I can't really see that. This fellow in the front.
If I added tax as one of a number of proposals that are floating around Washington to reduce spending and raise revenue, what would you say about some other proposals that haven't been brought up by the President or by Congressman Ryan?
Some other proposals like what?
So, I mean, people talk about a carbon tax, people talk about means testing, Social Security. I was wondering what you thought about some of the other proposals that haven't been brought up by President.
Well, let's talk first about carbon. You know, frankly, look, it's frustrating that we don't really have, we have not attached a price to carbon in the United States. At this point, to a first approximation, our climate policy is shale gas, frankly, because there's nothing else that's really driving reductions in greenhouse gas intensity. And I think the best evidence on the shale gas, by the way, is, despite some recent commentary to the contrary, is a noticeable decrease in greenhouse gas intensity relative to coal-fired electricity generation, but more research is necessary. A carbon tax is the kind of thing that, again, academics can virtually universally agree on, and that the political system has difficulty dealing with, I think because it comes back to this same core problem. Think about the nature of climate change. You're paying some upfront cost in terms of economic activity from having to transform the electricity sector in general. That is where most of the adjustment in the United States over the next couple decades to carbon intensity will occur or will have to occur. That is a painful and costly thing to do, and it manifests itself in the costs associated with the carbon tax in exchange for a long-run benefit. We don't do well with those kinds of trade-offs here in the United States where you're paying an upfront cost for a long-run benefit. And that is a fundamental, and frankly, it comes back to infrastructure spending too. That is a fundamental problem across climate policy, across fiscal policy, across parts of our healthcare policy, and with regard to infrastructure spending. And frankly, you know, it's easy to blame politicians in Washington and polarization, but ultimately it's our fault, because if we demanded a longer duration horizon from politicians and we punish them not for imposing short-term pain on us, but for not giving us long-term benefits, the system would change.
Mickey, are we going to noon? Is that the schedule?
No, 12:30.
Oh my gosh, then I have some time to ask questions. I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. Well, there are lots of questions out there, but I want to ask Peter one quick question that I didn't get to on the budget deficit. How high can, in your view, debt to GDP go? And I subscribe to the notion that as long as we stabilize debt to GDP at a certain level, and it could be higher than some people think, we'll be okay. And we can probably do that with a 3% ongoing deficit and a reasonable rate of growth. What's your analysis of that?
Well, just factually, you're right that at this point, roughly a 3% deficit would stabilize debt as a share of the economy. I think the challenge here is that it's not ultimately an answerable question where some threshold is for how high debt can get without causing a crisis, because it depends on investor confidence. Go back to those two cycles that I was talking about and the flipping from one to another. No one can tell you whether that will occur at a 70% public debt to GDP ratio or a 90% or 120%, because this cycle will continue as long as investors remain confident that the U.S. Treasury security in particular is the best safe haven available for to backstop the financial system. When that perception changes, and the risk that we have at this point, and the reason that this is dangerous, and that I'm less confident that we should just breezily say, oh, we can hit 100% of GDP and therefore we're under it and don't worry about it, is that investor confidence, once lost, is very difficult to regain. And the way I would put it is, we are taking an unnecessary risk that we will lose that confidence by not having a credible medium and longer term fiscal path. And that is not something that we want to lose.
Okay, I'm going to interject once in a while, but we have lots of questions. Right here. Thank you.
Thanks. If we assume that there is too much debt currently in the system, both consumers, state, federal, the only three ways, I think, to get out of that is either growth, inflation, or some form of broken promises in programs or debt restructuring or default. We've talked a lot about changing the programs, but there hasn't been much discussion on the other two aspects. And I was wondering, as you look forward to the eventual reduction of the excess debt, how much is going to be growth, how much is going to be inflation, and how much is going to be the rest of it?
So first, on growth, there's no doubt that growth helps. And I should have immediately said these deficit projections are highly uncertain, in part because they are very sensitive to growth rates. So for example, the projected deficit for 2015 under current policies is about 5% of GDP, 5% of the economy. The 90% confidence interval around that projection is plus or minus 5% of GDP. So it's really 0 to 10 with a central estimate of 5, which is, to your point, to say we might get lucky. We might wind up with faster than expected growth and a deficit even without any policy changes that's 1 or 2% of GDP under the 3% threshold, and the world looks good. I guess what I would say is, as Colin Powell once put it, luck is not a strategy. So just betting on getting lucky is not a great way to run the world's leading economic power. And the difficulty is that that thought, that growth helps reduce the deficit, sometimes then gets transferred into, migrates into what I will call the Laffer curve of the left. And the Laffer curve of the left takes the following two correct statements and transforms them into a third that is incorrect. A, growth reduces the deficit. B, in current economic environment, stimulus bills boost growth. So C, stimulus bills reduce the deficit. And you see people coming right up to that line and almost going over it, that additional measures to boost growth through cutting taxes or raising spending today to help fill in the GDP gap that we have today would actually reduce the deficit. There is no plausible, just like there's no plausible empirical evidence for the Laffer curve itself that reducing tax rates raises revenue. When we try to cut taxes, we do. When we try to raise taxes on net, we do, even when you build in the behavioral responses. Similarly, when you try to expand the deficit in order to boost short-term economic activity in a period of severe economic challenge, that is what you do.
Don't you think, though, Peter, because I have seen studies on this, that when the economy is running significantly below potential, there are moments when the economy can be stimulated through deficit spending on a temporary basis? I mean,
Yeah.
the Laffer curve was basically on a temporary basis, they could reduce the deficit in the short run.
Okay, it's the latter part that's the problem. So
I recognize, but
yeah.
that's what I'm asking you, because I have seen
it's-
statistical
I
analysis.
don't think so. So here's
with a
the-
high enough Keynesian multiplier.
Yeah, but let's walk through this, because I think I'm now confirming that this is sort of in play a little bit. You increase spending by $1, and let's say that I'm going to give a generous multiplier and say you increase economic activity by $1.50 as a result. What happens when you increase economic activity by $1.50? You raise somewhere between a quarter and a third of each dollar in additional revenue and reduced spending. So let's take the upper end of that range, and I'm trying to take the upper end of the multiplier range out there. That means that you get $1.50 in economic activity, you get a third offset from that, so you get 50 cents back in terms of higher revenue, lower spending because of the increased economic activity. You spent $1, you reduce the deficit by 50 cents as an offset. The net impact on the deficit is an increase of 50 cents. I think it is very difficult to get above a 50% offset on that initial impulse through any plausible set of scenarios, and it's basically stretching the bounds of plausibility beyond their stretching point to reverse the sign, to say more than 100% offset.
Okay, I'm not going to. Some people think there could be a higher Keynesian multiplier in certain economic circumstances, but let's leave the argument at that. Sir.
Could we come back to the turbulence around the debt ceiling
Sure.
for a minute?
if we're going to have turbulence, why shouldn't that be the first step, whether it's reflected in currency or interest rates or whatever, in this move to a different level on either what happens to the currency or what happens to interest rates?
I guess what I would say is it could be. It could be what triggers the flip from this cycle to another. I don't think it will be, because I think I don't think we are there yet in terms of plausible alternative safe havens for international creditors in particular. I mean, if you think about it, the common thread across Japan, the United States, and continental Europe is we're all kind of muddling through on our fiscal problems. This thing will shift more dramatically when there's a more plausible alternative safe haven for a variety of international assets, and we're not quite there yet. Now, I'm not denying that there's some risk that failing to raise the debt ceiling will convince people that we have a completely dysfunctional political process, and therefore that it will accelerate the moment at which we shift from one cycle to another. But I would be putting lower odds on that than temporary turbulence and then the big problem hitting at some point over the next 5 to 10 years as alternatives become more plausible. Currency versus interest rates. I would put somewhat higher weight on a sharp depreciation of the dollar than a sharp spike in interest rates, because, and this is a controversial and unknowable thing, but let's imagine, we already have the principle that the Federal Reserve is committed to stability in financial markets and will step in aggressively in severe turbulence. Imagine a world in which we are experiencing that flipping from one equilibrium to another. Treasury yields are spiking by 150 basis points, or there's some dramatic movement in the Treasury market. The question becomes, does the Federal Reserve step in more directly? Again, QE 2, 1, and 2 were not motivated primarily by that objective. But let's say, having established this basic principle, the Federal Reserve decides that it is so catastrophic to have that degree of turbulence in the fixed income markets and the contamination that can come from that, that it steps in more directly just to purchase Treasury securities in the open market to calm that market. The consequence of that would be an even sharper drop in the exchange rate. So if you attach any probability to that, and it's probably not a high probability, but any probability of that, the risk of a sharp depreciation in the dollar is somewhat higher than the risk of a sharp spike in interest rates.
I'm looking to, affirmative action-wise, looking for a woman, and I see one in the red sweater. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Social Security is a no-brainer so far.
No-brainer, okay. I mean, people are living longer, people are working longer. Why don't we just raise the age instead of trying to deal with Medicare and Medicaid? It just seems like an easy solution, but politically nobody will approach it.
Look, I'm a little bit frustrated because I would love Social Security to be put on a sounder long-term fiscal footing now, and let me explain why. It's not our core long-term fiscal problem, but many of the solutions have been discussed for a long period of time. It's not that hard technically to design something, and I think it would be a boost of confidence to show that this polarized political system can actually deal with something before we're in crisis mode, just to show that we can do it even though it's not the core fiscal problem.
I agree
now,
with you. It's just a beginning. But
it's a beginning.
An easy beginning.
Now the question becomes, and here I have to speak to some of my friends on the left, the opposition to doing Social Security reform now is stronger on the left than it is on the right. And I actually find that quite fascinating because 5 or 6 years ago when I co-authored a book with Peter Diamond, who then went on to win. I seem to co-author things with Nobel Prize winners, but in any case, they don't win, like, you don't get like an assist or anything, and he didn't win it for that, by any stretch of the imagination. The core debate was over individual accounts as part of Social Security, and as you mentioned, Mr. Ryan is still favoring that approach. despite Mr. Ryan's embrace, that issue has been definitively won by the left for now. It is not plausible that we are going to create individual accounts within Social Security at this point if we did reform. That would not be part of the reform package. I would think it would be beneficial to lock that in now rather than wait 15 years, and if financial markets pick up again, that idea is going to come back. To lock that in. In addition to that, you have the general arguments in favor of acting sooner rather than later, so you can phase things in more gradually. And then finally, the point I made earlier, one of the things that is driving more immediate fiscal austerity and therefore driving up the unemployment rate today relative to what we could achieve is lack of action on some of the longer-term fiscal issues. Social Security could help relieve some of that air pressure. So again, if you're mostly concerned about short-term economic activity, this is not a bad thing to do. Now, the counter-argument is the mix between revenue and benefits, and one would have to work that through. But I would also say even on that issue, the single tax revenue increase that polls higher than anything else, and therefore even some Republicans are in support of, is raising the maximum taxable earnings base under Social Security, applying the payroll tax up to a higher level.
Which is now about 100,000.
About 100, yeah. So what's happened over the past 2 or 3 decades as earnings at the top have grown much more rapidly than in the middle is an increasing share of total earnings has escaped that tax because the threshold is indexed to average earnings and not earnings at the top. We could walk that back in addition to indexing things to life expectancy, in addition to moving to a more accurate consumer price index, in addition to raising the maximum taxable earnings base, and you've basically then got a plan together. One thing I want to quickly say about life expectancy. Life expectancy has been rising in the United States now for a significant period of time, and many people know that, and they also know that better educated people, higher income people tend to live longer than less educated, lower income people. One thing that is not widely appreciated enough is the gap between life expectancy inequality, if you will, between higher earners and lower earners in life expectancy has been exploding in the United States. Over the past 2 decades, the increase in that gap is about as large as the increase in average life expectancy. And there are good reasons to fear that this growing trend differential in mortality rates will continue. When you look at the concentration of obesity and the concentration of smoking and the fact that fancy new medical innovations don't filter through the educational and income distribution immediately, this may well continue. One implication of that trend is that the Social Security system is increasingly becoming less progressive on a lifetime basis because higher earners are increasingly living longer than the average, and therefore they're getting their benefits for a longer period of time relative to the average. To my mind, that justifies making the annual benefit formula more progressive to offset part of that. And that's also a feature of many of the Social Security reform plans that are under discussion.
So some form of means testing?
It's not, means testing means you're cutting off benefits at the top. What I'm talking about is making the benefit formula, which currently sort of looks like this by lifetime earnings, look more like that.
Bend it.
And there are a variety of proposals out there. Now, interestingly also, again, it's the left that's opposed to many of those proposals because they fear that it will undermine the social fabric supporting Social Security. So you have the irony of a set of progressive benefit changes being opposed by progressives because they worry about the political economy. I would say take it. Lock it in.
In defense of the left, one reason the left thinks that Social Security is so popular is that almost everybody gets it. It's not considered a welfare program, and Peter has given you his view of that, and he thinks we should take it anyway. Another point is that the left believes if you open the door a little bit, it'll swing wide open at some future date. But let me reemphasize a point we agree with. Social Security is not the big issue in the deficit problem. It is a much smaller issue than Medicare and Medicaid and rising health care costs. You wanted to respond?
I agree with that, and I would just say, because I do feel strongly about this, I agree with the risk of a broader discussion happening if you open the door. I just think the risk of that gets worse over time, because if you look out over the next 5 or 10 years, the Senate in particular, in all likelihood, is going to shift more Republican, not less, and I would rather get this done now when you have a Democratic president and you still have a Democratic Senate than wait and take a risk that individual counts come back more forcefully and that your options are more limited because you've waited longer and you therefore don't have as much maneuvering room. But I know that other people have a different perspective.
There's a very anxious gentleman right there in the middle of that row, standing up.
Thank you very much. My name is Bill Jones. We are awash in fiscal problems, as we can see here, and I am so concerned for the life that my daughter and future generations are going to have because of these fiscal issues. And I agree with the woman over here. We have to do something. We have to take a step somehow, some way. Something has got to give. So along that line, I'd like to ask Peter, what did you do while you were with President Obama specifically to assist and help our nation get on a better financial footing? And if you happen to say you were there during universal health care, I would like a follow-up question to that, if I could.
Well, let me actually just jump to that. Let's go head on the Health Act, because there's no doubt that the popular impression is that it does nothing to constrain healthcare costs. That's the popular impression. I think the final bill is much better than that popular impression, which is not hard if you have a baseline of 0. Raising the interesting question, by the way, of why the popular impression is what it is. And I actually think that that's due to 2 factors. The first is that first impressions matter a lot. First impressions on this legislation were formed during the crucial summer of 2009, when the only bill that was out in the public was the House bill, which in this tension between coverage and cost tilted way towards coverage and not towards structural cost containment. The theory of the case, by the way, was the final bill will be much closer to the Senate bill. The Senate bill will have more in it that does structural cost containment, so don't worry too much. But nonetheless, that was the first impression. The reality was the final bill does have a variety of things that the House bill did not have that are quite important. The second explanation is it's messy. It's easy to say individual choice. It's a lot harder to say we have to focus on provider quality and incentives, and that's necessarily evolutionary, where we try something, we adjust, we try something, and we adjust, especially given a polarized political environment. But what I'm going to basically say is I'd like to know, honestly, because I am quite curious about this, and having sat through innumerable Institute of Medicine meetings and meetings that I convened as the head of the Congressional Budget Office, we now have a dramatic example with the Ryan Plan of perhaps the leading counterexample to that provider quality focus, which, if anything, is much worse. So if one doesn't accept the basic theory of the case of the Independent Payment Advisory Board and the excise tax and the Innovation Center and all the various other things that are built into the Health Act, and we can have a discussion about them, the relevant question is, and perhaps adding in an evidence-based med-mal system as a supplement, the relevant question is, okay, so what is the solution? Because if there is no solution, we might as well just have a big party, because if we're going to, if we're on an unsustainable course and there's nothing we can do, might as well enjoy it before it blows up.
Let me go to some other people, because we've got a lot.
I know.
It's just not.
I have a great counterpoint, though.
Maybe you can grab.
Just quickly. Okay. Here's part of the dysfunction of our federal government in that I don't believe what OMB says any longer, nor any of those agencies that come out with
Quick question.
Okay. We don't believe the numbers anymore. You know, I mean, when the
that's enough.
prescription benefit was added.
Can you answer that on the prescription?
Please,
sir. There are lots of people waiting.
Let me just say.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Don't apologize. Look, the fact of the matter is, this is one of the consequences of the blogosphere and polarization. We have, frankly, undermined. I won't speak to OMB because that's part of the administration, and that is what it is. But as the director of the Congressional Budget Office, I can tell you. And by the way, while as an ex-director of the Congressional Budget Office, I didn't always like what it said. But the fact of the matter is that institution is the most independent and rigorous institution that I have ever encountered in my entire life. And the fact that even its estimates are then attacked politically, I think speaks to this polarization and blogosphere notion. Now, let me just as an example give you the Medicare prescription drug benefit as an example. The fact of the matter is, and this is not, you can verify this yourself, there were different estimates out when the Medicare prescription drug benefit was enacted. What's interesting is, and what people don't really focus on is, CBO was here, the administration was here, or the actuary was here. The reality has come in dramatically below, not above. Key point. Estimates are not always biased one way or another. The prescription drug benefit, Part D under Medicare, is costing substantially less, and we're talking over 10 years, hundreds of billions of dollars less than was originally projected. Now, some people recognize that and they say that's because of competition. Actually, what seems to have happened is at the time the projections were being done, we had not as dramatically shifted away from new complex molecules and towards generic pharmaceuticals in particular, which is occurring both inside of Medicare and outside of Medicare. Pharmaceutical spending has decelerated writ large on the consumer side, and that feeds into Part D also. So you're more than entitled to your view. I think it's sad that your view is common, that even the independent agencies, whether it's the Congressional Budget Office or the Government Accountability Office, I think you're right to say there is more skepticism now, and I just think the skepticism is unwarranted and fed by this blogosphere cable news environment, but it's absolutely an issue.
Okay, I think one of the issues with CBO, and some people don't fully understand the constraints of the assumptions that are underlying.
Yeah, and actually, very quickly, that's actually another point. Rather than denigrating CBO, I think it is a legitimate concern to say CBO analyzes legislation. It is not supposed to project what future Congresses are going to do. And even though its analyses of what's on paper might well be the best unbiased ones that we can have, admitting there's lots of uncertainty, no one is to say that you will actually implement the legislation as it's specified, which is what CBO's job is. That critique, I feel some sympathy for, which is future Congresses undoubtedly will adjust one way or another, and therefore the CBO numbers, even if they were technically right, are going to wind up being wrong because the legislation changes. But that's a different layer than sort of attacking the numbers on paper for what they're supposed to be.
Okay, this side, right here. Thank you. I think. Yes.
Peter, I want to go back to the very first place that you started, which was the presumption that the Ryan Plan provided a great opportunity for President Obama and his position. And let me say that I agree with your factual statement of the theory of the Ryan case, and even The Economist magazine, which is not necessarily on President Obama's side in most cases, said something much like that, your factual theory of the case. Despite that, there are some pretty smart guys on the other side, including not only Ryan, but also Eric Cantor, who's a pretty smart guy, who are totally ignoring your factual theory of the case and presenting what they claim is an alternative factual theory of the case. And they refer to many research studies that present the opposite.
Let's get to the question.
The question is, what is it that causes you to believe that a profession like the economics profession, which is primarily associated with theories and not with facts these days, will in fact stop supporting the supply side factual theory of the case, which they claim is factual?
Well, let me say two things. First, I don't actually think that professional economists are the key driver of political outcomes. So, A. B, a large concern with academic economics as it has developed over the past 2 or 3 decades is not, I'm more worried that of sort of wasted opportunity than of political bias from at least professional academic economists. And the wasted opportunity is economics as a field has gotten falsely attracted to the mathematical purity of physics and wanting to show off mathematical ability rather than any real-world applicability. And so we have been playing theoretical games that are not particularly useful for anyone to a degree that's much beyond what, in my mind, should or could be justified. I guess the final point is it will be the ultimate demise of our civilization if the polarization and the blogosphere news chatter means that we are literally in a world in which facts do not matter at all. There is some risk. I mean, Eric Schmidt raises this really interesting problem, which is given the proliferation of news outlets and news sources, that the default that we have we've been trained psychologically. When we hear something on television or when we read something in print, that our default is we assume it's true. If someone says X, states X, you have been trained to sort of give it the benefit of the doubt because it's in print or on the air. At this point, I think it's arguable that well under half of what we are reading or hearing is not true. It's, and again, that came from a world in which we had newspapers that were kind of centrist and fact-checked, and we had the three main broadcast stations that were attempting to do some sort of filtering. That no longer exists. So in addition to, I think this transformation is quite deep in terms of having to retrain ourselves to assume the opposite, assume something's false when you first hear it until you verify it yourself. That is a significant change. The other change the other consequence of this blogosphere news feedback loop, which changes people's behavior in Washington and elsewhere, is basically discussions that used to be effectively water cooler talk, and therefore local and ephemeral, they would just kind of disappear, are now permanent and global. And if the old saying that no man is a hero to his valet, that, I guess the question is, would Abraham Lincoln have survived in today's world? And I think not. And therein lies a huge challenge for our society beyond the fact-based one in terms of leadership and what is possible given the evolution of technology, which is going to be very difficult to reverse.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir? It's first hand I saw, I'm sorry. Can you...
Okay.
Would you comment...
It's for the video, though.
I can repeat it if you want.
Okay.
Would you comment on the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission and your opinion of the recommendations, and also on why it's not the center point of what we're talking about today?
Look, I think Bowles and Simpson did a very good job in raising the profile of this issue, in putting forward some specifics. I still think the most auspicious specific outcome involves Social Security, which would have to be adjusted, in my mind, for a better balance between revenue and benefits. But I think it is actually laying the groundwork for the Gang of Six discussions, and frankly, even for the general construct of what the president put forward. And why don't I actually just end on a little vignette that involves Mr. Simpson in particular. Before the commission was named, Mr. Bowles and Mr. Simpson came in to see the president. And I don't know if you know, I mean, Erskine Bowles is this very refined Southern gentleman type, and Alan Simpson is the crusty, colorful Westerner. Alan Simpson marches into the Oval Office, does something I've never seen anyone do, which is, there are these chairs, the president's there, the vice president's here. This is the vice president's chair. It's supposed to be for the vice president. Alan Simpson sits himself down in the vice president's chair. And then I'm going to have to moderate this because it's their cameras. But he starts to say that he's willing to do this, but he realizes that Rush Limbaugh is really going to attack him. And he said, "Mr. President, I'm going to do this for you and for the nation because I think it's important. But boy, I'm going to get attacked viciously by the Rush Limbaugh types." And then something that I've never seen happen before. He said, "That reminds me of a joke, Mr. President." So the joke was that this guy buys a very expensive car, and he returns it to the dealer very frustrated and says, "I just spent $250,000 on this car, and the radio doesn't even work." And the dealer says, "No, you don't understand. This is such an advanced car, it's got an advanced radio. You articulate what you want, it will come on the radio. You say jazz, on comes the jazz station. You say country, on comes the country music station. The guy is once again very proud of his new $250,000 car, wants to show it off to his family and friends, quite proudly drives it off the lot, gets cut off, says jerk, and Rush Limbaugh comes on the radio. True story.
I was going to interject something serious, but I think we should stop on that note. Peter, that was an excellent interview. Very clarifying. Thank you so much. And before we go, I wanted to thank Mickey Straus, the Hamptons Institute, Ellen Chesler and Andy Rich of the Roosevelt Institute, and Steve Croft for being called away on business so I could be here with Peter and the rest of you.
Thank you.
Peter, thanks very much.
Let me thank the panel. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.